Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
My brother Eric raised his glass like he was accepting an award he hadn't earned yet, and, with that lazy little smirk he saves for moments when he thinks the room belongs to him, announced that by Christmas he would be running my company, and my dad, who has always trusted diplomas more than proof, nodded along and offered one of those fatherly chuckles that sounds supportive to anyone who hasn't lived in our family, while I, keeping my face steady because I refused to give either of them the satisfaction of watching me flinch, finished my drink in one long swallow and stood up before the silence turned into applause. If you've ever been the one who cleans messes no one else admits making, you already understand the math of our family, because Eric has the fancy degree and the polished talking points and the habit of mistaking other people's labor for his potential. Dad has the stories about building something from nothing and the blind spot that grows every time someone praises his son, and I have the inbox with the unpaid invoices, the weekend calls from vendors, the late evenings spent smoothing over promises my father made and forgot, and the early mornings spent telling people they still had a job because I found a way to stretch one more line of credit without letting the bank smell blood. I walked out of that dinner not because I was hurt, which would have been honest but useless, and not because I was angry, which I was, and which I know how to carry like a heavy bag I can set down later, but because I knew both of them were counting on me to protest and plead and perform the role of the overly emotional woman who doesn't understand business, and I decided in that moment that if they were going to cast me, I would give them the opposite performance and let them drown in their own lines. In the car, I said my brother's sentence out loud, slowly, just to hear how ridiculous it sounded when you already know the payroll dates by heart and can recite the client renewal calendar without looking at a spreadsheet, and then I called Maya, our chief financial officer, who has seen me patch more leaks than she can count and who never repeats gossip, and I told her, without drama, that Dad was gearing up for a transition story and Eric was promising timelines to people who don't like surprises, and she said the sentence every woman who builds things needs to hear sometimes, which is that I wasn't crazy, and the numbers love whoever treats them right. I went back to the office even though it was late for most people and exactly the right hour for me, because after years of doing the unglamorous work you develop a rhythm that doesn't ask permission. And I opened a folder I created the week my father first suggested I take a little time off for my stress, a folder labeled with a harmless word that meant something sharp, and I pulled up the covenant summaries on our credit line, the ones that include the clause about changes in executive leadership requiring lender consent, a clause my father hates because he thinks it is a leash, and I drafted the calmest email I have ever written. The kind of email that reads like housekeeping until you understand what house we are talking about. Addressed to our relationship manager at the bank and copied to Linda, our board chair, and Maya, and I asked for a standard compliance letter to reconfirm that any planned or rumored leadership change would need written board approval and lender sign-off in advance, because we value stability and transparency and want to protect our people from speculation. Before I pressed send, I pictured Eric practicing his takeover smile in a mirror, the one that suggests he is doing you a favor by replacing you, and I let that image sit there until it felt as small as it actually is. Then I hit send and watched the message leave my screen like a paper airplane with a steel tip, and I followed it with two more quiet moves that have nothing to do with showmanship and everything to do with control. First, by updating the authorized signatory list to reflect the board resolution from last quarter that Dad never read carefully, the one that elevated my approval threshold for any personnel changes at the officer level, and second by asking Denise, our outside counsel who thinks in checklists the way some people breathe, to schedule a routine governance review for early next week with an agenda item that reads innocently but translates to do not try anything cute. On the way home, I replayed the dinner in my head, not to punish myself with the words, but to line them up like dominoes so I could choose which ones to tip over first. And I thought about the years when I said yes to every unglamorous task because someone needed to, and the years when Eric said yes to resume lines because they sounded important, and I realized something that settled me in a way no pep talk ever does, which is that people who have never been told no are always confused when the word arrives with paperwork attached. When I finally walked through my door, my phone buzzed with a reply from the bank that was both boring and beautiful, confirming receipt and promising a formal letter by morning, which meant that anyone who tried to play musical chairs with a title would find the music shut off by compliance before their second step. And a minute later, Linda forwarded me a message from Dad in which he floated the phrase temporary leadership adjustment, a phrase that would make me laugh if it weren't so predictable, and she asked, in her crisp way that still manages to feel like a hand on my shoulder, whether I was available for coffee very early the next day. I wrote back that I would be there and that I would bring the documents she would want to see, and then, because I am not above a little pettiness when it protects my people, I removed the automatic visitor access on Eric's profile so that if he showed up to play boss without clearance, he would have to wait at the front desk like any other guest. Which is not the kind of revenge you brag about, but exactly the kind that reminds a man that a badge is not the same as authority, and I lay down, knowing that I had not won anything yet, but that I had finally moved the game back to the rules that actually exist. What I did not expect, although I should have, was the voicemail that landed after midnight from one of our oldest clients, a woman named Carol who has known our company longer than Eric has known how to format an email, telling me that he had hinted over drinks about a leadership change and that she does not sign contracts with people who treat her like a rumor, and asking whether I needed her to put something in writing for the board, which felt like the universe handing me a tool I was already prepared to use. And when I saved that voicemail into the folder with the covenant letters and the signatory update and the governance agenda, I finally smiled, not because the fight was over, but because it was finally happening on the ground where I win. And just when I thought the night was done, another message came in, this time from Dad, short by his standards and full of that parental tone that pretends concern while drawing blood, inviting me to a so-called family strategy breakfast in 2 days to discuss what he called a graceful handoff. And as I listened to it twice and forwarded it to Linda without commentary, I realized that the only grace I would be offering would come wrapped in policy and signatures, because if they wanted a ceremony, they could have a compliance meeting, and when I set my alarm for an hour earlier than usual, I knew exactly what I would slide across the table at coffee, and exactly how I would keep my face calm while I did it, and exactly how I would answer when Dad asked whether I planned to make this difficult. Linda does not waste words or time, so when I slid into the booth at the diner across from the office and set the printed bank email between the salt shaker and the napkin holder, she read it once, nodded like someone who sees a chessboard and knows where the pieces actually live, and said that if my father wanted a story about a graceful handoff, then we would give him a script about stability and fiduciary duty instead, which would be a lot less fun at family dinners and a lot more persuasive to people who sign agreements and enforce covenants. And by the time the coffee cooled, she had agreed to the move I wanted, which was simple on the surface and brutal underneath, because we would treat Eric as what he is, a visitor, and we would do it politely. On paper, in front of witnesses who care about titles only when they map to responsibility. Back at the building, the front desk did exactly what front desks are designed to do when policy is clear, which is to smile and point. Because when Eric tried to breeze past with that half-laugh that works on bartenders and groupies, but not on a woman who checks names for a living, he learned in real time that automatic access had been removed and his badge produced a cheerful red light. And while he sputtered something about being family and leadership and how none of this was necessary, I walked in with Maya and Linda and said good morning in the same tone I used to open a staff meeting, then handed him a packet with a calm paragraph at the top explaining that until the board completed its scheduled governance review and our lender issued the customary confirmation, anyone not currently serving as an officer would be classified as an external observer, which meant a visitor agreement, a confidentiality reaffirmation, and a temporary badge that did not open doors to places he had no business entering. And I watched him sign, because people like Eric always sign when they think the signature is a formality rather than a line that will be read out loud later. Dad arrived 2 minutes after that, full of paternal charm and fake surprise, and he tried to turn the lobby into a reunion scene by hugging the receptionist and addressing the security guard by first name, as if that would make a policy bend. But the guard, who has seen divorces and mergers and more than a few men with father issues, looked at me. I nodded once, and the process continued, which is to say that Dad also signed the visitor log, because there are no exceptions in a building that houses other companies and takes liability seriously, and for a small second that felt larger than it looked, I let the silence sit there, not to humiliate him, but to let him hear what everyone else could already hear, which was the difference between entitlement and authority. We took the elevator together, and the ride felt longer than it was because Dad kept up a steady stream of comments about how excited he was for a smooth transition and how good it would be for morale to show a united family front. And Eric tossed in a few nods about mentorship and knowledge transfer that would have sounded generous if they were not addressed to the person who had been mentoring and transferring knowledge to other people for years. And when the doors opened, I led them into the conference room where Denise had already placed a neat stack of agendas marked governance review, a phrase that looks dull until it saves your company, and I introduced Eric to the room, not with a flourish or a title he had not earned, but with the exact words our policy required, calling him a temporary external advisor who would be observing operations during the scheduled review period, and I watched the eyes around the table register the sentence the way trained people do, which is to look at the words, look at the signer, and then look at the person whose name sits beside decision rights. Eric tried to rally by launching into a little speech about vision and modernization, and how his background positioned him to lead a digital transformation we apparently needed. And I let him run for a minute because it is always useful to let a man show his understanding before you test it, and when he paused for approval I asked him, as evenly as I could, to walk the room through the renewal calendar for our top 5 accounts, and the exact margin impact of the two he had suggested discounting last quarter when he was dabbling in operations from a safe distance, and as soon as he started guessing I placed the printed bank email on the table with the sentence about leadership consent highlighted just enough to be visible. Then asked Maya to read the line item on our credit covenants that ties covenant compliance to executive changes, and the shift in the air was not dramatic, it was practical. The way a room of professionals recalibrates around the person who shows their homework, while the other person waves around their confidence. Dad reacted the way men who hate being cornered by paper always react, by raising his voice just enough to imply urgency rather than panic and insisting that these were technicalities we could sort out after the announcement. And I said the phrase that has carried me through every hard meeting, which is that our people deserve boring stability more than they deserve exciting speeches, then handed Denise the pre-written memo she had asked me to draft, a short, dry, unglamorous company-wide note, reiterating that there were no leadership changes planned or contemplated at this time, that the board had scheduled a routine governance review, and that during this period any non-officers participating in meetings would do so as observers. And I asked her to send it from her office so no one could pretend it was emotional or reactive, and within minutes it hit inboxes with the lawyerly tone that makes gossip fold like wet cardboard. There are petty victories and there are structural ones, and labeling Eric in public as an observer rather than a leader felt like both at once, because while I kept my face calm and my tone professional, inside I let myself enjoy the quiet cheer I could feel rising from the people who have carried this company through rough quarters and who do not deserve a soap opera on top of their workloads. And when the meeting ended with action items that did not include any of the fantasies Dad had been peddling, I walked them to the door, thanked them for coming, and told Eric that if he wanted to be useful, he could sit with operations for the afternoon and take notes on the intake queue, which he pretended to accept until he realized intake involves actual customers with actual complaints. I was back at my desk reviewing a vendor escalation when 2 messages landed almost on top of each other. The first from Carol saying that if Eric invited her to lunch to talk takeover, she would be delighted to bring her general counsel, and a very direct set of questions about covenant compliance. And the second from Linda with a subject line that carried no drama and all the power, asking me to come by the boardroom with my notes, because the chair wanted to walk through a confidential action. That would keep our lenders comfortable and our people safe, and as I stood up, I realized the lobby lesson had done its work, because for the first time since that ridiculous toast, they were the ones scrambling for a plan while I was already holding the document that would make theirs impossible. The boardroom did not look dramatic, and I was grateful for that, because while some people need ceremony to feel important, I have learned that the most durable power usually travels on plain paper. So when Linda closed the door and asked Maya to walk us through the short list of exposures that would flare if anyone tried to play musical chairs with leadership, I listened the way I always do when the stakes are real. And when she finished with the line about how our lender's consent requirement, the customer renewal timing, and the union contract that ties wage review to executive continuity all pull in the same direction, I said that if we were going to protect our people from a vanity project, then we should do it with something that looks boring enough to survive every rumor, and Linda, who has a smile that can flatten nonsense without raising her voice, pulled from her folder a draft. I had only asked for an outline, a short resolution plus a companion policy that would sit inside our governance binder like a fire extinguisher with the pin removed, and she asked if I was prepared to sign my part today if the votes went the way she expected. I said yes, because waiting has never made men like my father less certain of themselves, and as Denise reviewed the language one last time, she talked through what would follow, not with fanfare but with the tone of someone ordering parts for a machine that must not fail, explaining that the resolution would formalize what has been functionally true for a long time, which is that the chief operating authority rests with the person who has been carrying it, and that any change to that authority would require a board supermajority plus written lender consent plus a certification from our council that operational risk had been mitigated. And while that may sound like a fortress, to me it sounded merely fair, because the alternative is letting two men rewrite reality with a toast. We did not ignore optics, because they matter when you are protecting a company, so we planned the communication cadence the way you plan a crisis you refuse to escalate, with Denise sending the second memo to staff after lunch about the scheduled governance review sessions and the upcoming renewal calls. I would be leading with clients who do not enjoy surprises, with Maya quietly flagging payroll that no title or reporting line would change without her written sign-off, and with Linda calling the two board members who enjoy the theater of control to explain, in a voice that could be bottled and sold as calm, that the fastest way to lose lender patience is to let family politics leak into a covenant test. All of that was the scaffolding, but the turning point arrived in the form of an email I should have predicted and almost did, because Eric, who cannot resist the game of telling someone important that something big is coming, sent a cheerful calendar invite to Carol for a lunch he described as a forward-looking conversation about new leadership priorities, and he copied Dad and two senior managers as if volume could give the message weight, and Carol, who has been on the receiving end of my weekend problem-solving and knows the difference between paint and primer, forwarded it to me with a single sentence that said she was happy to attend with counsel and that she would open by asking him to define the scope of authority he believed he held, which, translated into our language, meant she was handing me a test case with witnesses. I accepted the invitation on Eric's behalf before he had a chance to withdraw it, because sometimes the only way to show a fool the hole is to let him keep walking until he notices the drop. And I asked Denise to join as neutral company counsel and Maya to bring the renewal calendar and margin sheets, and I told myself I would not gloat, I would simply watch. And then I would write down the parts that mattered and place them where paper can do something useful. Lunch began with Eric doing what he always does when he wants to look generous and in charge, which is to talk about vision in a way that avoids detail, and Carol let him run for almost a minute before she touched the folder next to her and asked, with the kind of kindness that is actually a scalpel, whether he could confirm which signature block he believed he had the right to use on contract amendments, and whether he could walk her through the renewal windows and risk thresholds for the two accounts he had mentioned discounting last quarter when he was play-acting operator from a safe keyboard, and when he started swallowing his words, Denise gently read the sentence from the staff memo about observer status and lack of signing authority, then passed him the printed bank letter that restated the consent requirement, and the look on his face was not humiliation the way movies enjoy showing it, it was the slower, heavier realization that he had confused performance with confidence. And that people in this room knew the difference. Dad tried to rescue him with his speech about legacy and family unity and how these were just transitional conversations, and I let him speak because interruptions can feel like panic and I refuse to look panicked when I am holding the receipts. And when he finally stopped, Carol said she appreciated families and legacies, but she signs with companies and leaders who return calls and hit numbers, not with predictions, and then she turned to me and asked, not with fanfare but with the same practicality that has kept her on top for decades, whether I had the renewal plan we discussed last week and whether I could commit to the pricing corridor we had mapped based on volumes, and I said yes, because I had done the work. And she reached across and handed me a letter of intent already signed, contingent on leadership stability and covenant compliance, and she asked that our council file it with the board so no one could misinterpret where her support sat. I did not look at Eric because I have learned that looking at a person in that moment is like handing them an excuse to claim cruelty. So I looked at Denise and asked her to scan and send the letter to Linda with the subject line we had agreed to use when the right event presented itself, and then I thanked Carol for her candor and her patience and for teaching me, years ago, that the only leverage that matters is the kind you can read out loud without blushing, and when lunch ended I walked back to the office with Denise and Maya while Dad and Eric huddled in the parking lot drafting a new story for themselves, and I did not interfere because they were busy and I had something better to do. In the boardroom, Linda was waiting with the folder she keeps for decisions that cannot wobble, and she asked me, without any ceremony at all, to sign my part of the document we had reviewed that morning. The one that would sit quietly in the binder tonight and speak loudly tomorrow if anyone tried to improvise, and I took the pen, wrote my name with a hand that did not shake, and slid the pages back across the table, and Linda signed, and Denise notarized, and Maya filed the banks. Confirmation beside it, and the room exhaled in that almost invisible way that tells you something heavy has been placed somewhere safe, and as I stood to leave, Linda said that tomorrow would be busy and I should get some rest, and I said I would try, and I meant it. But I also knew that when Dad and Eric arrived in the morning to test their new script, they would meet a closed door that looked like a policy and felt like a lesson, and that what waited behind it would not be a scene or a speech but a title they had already lost without realizing it. I arrived early that morning not because I was nervous, but because I believe that control doesn't begin when the meeting starts, it begins when you decide how the room should feel the moment someone walks into it. So I had already reviewed the updated talking points, confirmed the document folders on each seat were identical, and asked facilities to swap out the name placards to reflect the board's latest resolution, with mine now reading what it should have read months ago, not interim, not acting, not default, but simply Chief Executive Officer, and while that might sound like a small cosmetic change to someone who's never had to explain their own title twice to get the respect owed once, to me it felt like a line finally drawn in ink instead of pencil, and I was ready for them to see it before I said a word. They arrived together, which didn't surprise me, because men like my father and Eric operate better in pairs, especially when they think numbers can be overruled with volume, and as soon as Eric spotted the placard his posture changed in that subtle, defensive way you don't notice unless you've been underestimated before, and Dad, still clutching the belief that this was a family matter rather than a corporate one, smiled at the room like he was about to introduce a best man at a wedding then confront the consequences of being outmaneuvered on his own stage, and as they sat, I watched Eric scan the folders, probably hoping for some vague note of shared power, only to realize each document was labeled with the resolution number the board had passed the day before, the same resolution that quietly cemented the organizational structure they had both spent 2 weeks pretending didn't exist. I opened the meeting without theatrics because nothing drives insecure people faster toward panic than calm leadership that doesn't need validation, and I walked the room through the agenda with the kind of ease that comes only when you've actually done the work, listing each item, from upcoming contract renewals to operational realignment proposals to Q3 budget forecasts, with the same neutral tone I'd used in 100 previous meetings that neither of them had bothered to attend when they thought the company ran on autopilot, and I made sure the biggest items were early on the list so there would be no room for anyone to suggest the conversation was derailed by emotion, because the truth is, Nothing is more boring than watching a takeover plan dissolve under the weight of bullet points and accountability. Eric waited until we hit a pause, then tried to pivot the conversation back to what he clearly still believed was a negotiation, using phrases like succession clarity and shared vision, and even throwing in a half-hearted joke about not stealing too much thunder. But when no one laughed and no one nodded, he shifted into a tone I've heard before, the kind of forced professionalism that sounds polished on paper but cracks under pressure, and he asked whether the board had considered the long-term optics of presenting a single executive face to both internal and external stakeholders without broader leadership engagement, which, translated, meant he still thought he could spin a seat at the table into authority if he just found the right jargon. I answered without flinching, because flinching is for people who expect fairness from people who've never offered it, and I reminded the room that our stakeholders, internal and external, have overwhelmingly signaled their preference for continuity and competence over pageantry and politics, and that the board's decision, reaffirmed in writing and reflected in every policy and process we've executed since, is based on performance and not perception, and as I said this, I watched Dad shift in his seat, the way he always does when he realizes the numbers no longer back the story he's telling, and I gave him the courtesy of silence rather than contradiction, because silence forces reflection. And nothing is more disarming to someone used to controlling a room than being left to sit in their own unfinished sentence. Denise took over the next part of the meeting, walking through the legal implications of the new governance policy, including language that made it crystal clear that any attempt to exert or imply authority outside of the board-approved structure would trigger not only internal review, but external disclosure requirements to lenders and regulatory bodies. And as she read, she didn't look up, not because she was being cold, but because when you're enforcing a policy rather than defending a person, there's no need to make eye contact. The words are enough, and I watched both Eric and Dad realize that even if they argued, even if they protested or pleaded or postured, there was no longer a person to persuade, only documents to comply with. When the meeting adjourned, it was not dramatic, it was surgical, because power, when properly structured, does not require drama to land its point. It just exists in the room, in the records, in the decisions made before anyone raises their voice. And as I gathered my folder and walked toward the door, Dad asked if we could chat privately, using the same tone he's used for years to imply that business should be paused for the comfort of men who feel blindsided by their own lack of planning. And I turned to him, not cruelly, not coldly, but with the clarity that only comes from having been both underestimated and overprepared, and said that we could schedule something next week if the agenda required it, but that today, my afternoon was full of real work. Outside the conference room, Maya handed me a printout from our head of HR, confirming the updated org chart had been distributed company-wide with the new reporting lines and title references, and I thanked her, not because I needed the reassurance, but because acknowledgement matters to people who've helped carry the weight. And as I walked back to my office, the one with the new plaque already mounted beside the door, I passed Eric standing by the elevators, phone in hand, no doubt trying to rewrite the morning into something salvageable, and I kept walking, not out of spite, but because once you stop making yourself small for other people's comfort, there's nothing left to wait around for. By the time I sat back at my desk, Carol had emailed to confirm that her legal team had received all updated documents and was moving forward with the contract extension, adding a short note that read, "Solid leadership always wins in the end." And I allowed myself a moment, not to celebrate, not to gloat, but to remember that when someone tells you they'll be running your company by Christmas, and you spend the next week reminding them that actual leadership is earned, not inherited, the only thing you owe them when they show up ready to take over is a door that stays closed until they learn to knock. When people think about revenge, they picture something loud or explosive or theatrical, a confrontation, a walkout, a mic drop moment that turns a room into a memory. But what they don't understand, what they'll probably never understand unless they've spent years cleaning up other people's messes in silence, is that the most satisfying kind of justice doesn't arrive with a spotlight or applause. It arrives slowly and thoroughly and irreversibly. like ink sinking into paper that no one can erase. And on that final morning, when Eric and my father walked into the building expecting to claim something they thought they still had a chance of owning, they walked directly into the end of their story, without realizing that the last chapter had already been written without their input. They came earlier than usual, earlier than expected, likely believing that showing up before everyone else would project initiative or control or some kind of symbolic authority. But what they found when they reached the top floor wasn't a boardroom waiting for instructions or a staff holding their breath, but instead a locked door with a printed notice on company letterhead, not dramatic, not accusatory, just clear and official and final, stating that access to the executive suite was restricted to officers listed on record as of the previous day's filing, and that any meetings, strategy sessions, or personnel discussions would be conducted only through scheduled appointments arranged by executive assistants assigned to the listed officers. And because no one had scheduled anything for them, because they were no longer listed, because the illusion had finally collapsed under the weight of the actual structure, they stood there for several minutes in silence that no one was going to break for them. The receptionist, who had already seen enough of their ego over the past 2 weeks to fill a season's worth of office gossip, didn't even flinch when Eric asked whether this was some kind of joke or misunderstanding. And when she calmly repeated that all visitors must wait in the common area until called, she did so with the quiet strength of someone who finally saw policy defend the people who had been doing the work all along, and I, from my office, which now had not only my name but also the newly installed CEO seal beside the door, watched it unfold on the monitor without smiling, not because it wasn't satisfying, but because I had no interest in turning their downfall into a performance when the documents already did that more effectively than I ever could. Inside, we were preparing for the actual leadership meeting, the real one, with legal, finance, operations, and communications present, the one that moved actual strategy forward, and as I briefed the team on the next quarter's plans, I let myself appreciate the contrast between what they were expecting and what was actually happening. They believed they would walk in, take over, delegate, smile for a few photos, and hand-wave their way into leadership. Instead, they were outside the decision-making process, stripped not just of title but of relevance, because once the structure is secure and the trust is redistributed, it's not just the position they lose, it's the access, the awareness, the invisible current of influence they assumed would always flow in their direction. Halfway through the meeting, I received a message from HR confirming that Eric had requested a sit-down under the pretense of clarifying his future role, and that my father had separately asked whether the board might reconsider their tone, given the family history, and I dictated the same response for both, that we appreciated their past involvement, but moving forward, any future requests should be routed through official channels, and that all leadership roles were now subject to board review in accordance with governance policy adopted under Resolution 14B, and if they wished to be considered for any future operational contribution, they were free to submit a formal application with the same supporting documentation required of any other external candidate, which I knew they never would. Not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't lower themselves to the level they assumed everyone else belonged to. Later that afternoon, I walked past the visitor area where they were still seated, no longer posturing, no longer gesturing like generals surveying a field, but just sitting, waiting, processing, calculating their next narrative. And I nodded at them once, not with malice or pity, but with the same detached professionalism they had failed to show me for years, and I kept walking, because the meeting I was heading to involved people who had earned their place through contribution, not connection. And I wasn't going to waste time making them feel seen when they had spent years pretending not to see me. By the time the building cleared for the evening, I was still at my desk, finalizing a memo to staff summarizing the next quarter's vision, not filled with buzzwords or empty promises, just facts, clarity, and structure. And when I signed it as Chief Executive Officer, I didn't linger on the title, because by now it wasn't about what the nameplate said, but about the authority behind it. Authority earned not with degrees or legacy or bluster, but with grit, patience, and the kind of unwavering Focus it takes to carry a company on your back, while everyone assumes you're just keeping a seat warm for someone flashier. The last email I sent that night was to Carol, thanking her for the leverage, for the timing, for the reminder that smart women help each other win when the stakes are real, and she replied with a line that I will probably never forget. You didn't just hold the line, you made it permanent. And as I shut down my screen and turned off the lights, I let myself sit for a moment in the stillness, not because the fight was over, but because I had finally reached the part of the story where I didn't have to fight for what I already owned. They came to take over. They left empty-handed. And the door they thought would swing wide for them now only opens for the one person who never stopped doing the work, even when no one thought she should have been in the room.